Eastern Ghouta has been dominating headlines since the Syrian government launched a military operation to retake the Damascus suburb. But if your only understanding of Eastern Ghouta is from the Western media reports, then you're left with the impression that there's a one-sided war featuring the Syrian government against civilians. But this war isn't one-sided. The Syrian government is battling an armed insurgency that occupies Eastern Ghouta, which is one of the last remaining strongholds of the Islamist rebellion that tore through the country these last several years. So, who is this armed insurgency? The Western press usually glorifies them as moderate rebels, even freedom fighters. But the reality is that Eastern Ghouta is under the control of a collection of extremist groups, the strongest of which is Jaish al-Islam, or the Army of Islam. Jaish al-Islam is a Salafi jihadist group backed by Saudi Arabia that seeks to replace the Syrian government with an Islamic state. The militant group is extremely sectarian and just as nasty in its rhetoric, tactics, and goals as ISIS. The group's founder, the late Zahran al-Lush, openly called for ethnic cleansing of religious minorities from Damascus. And the group has been known to engage in public executions and parade caged civilian women and minorities in the streets as human shields. Most recently, civilians fleeing Eastern Ghouta have reported being fired on by militants seeking to prevent them from escaping to the safety of government-controlled territory, another fact that Western media outlets almost always ignore. So where is Western media getting its information on Eastern Ghouta from? Well, there are three main sources. First is the White Helmets, a rescue group heavily funded by the US and UK governments that advocates for Western intervention while working alongside al-Qaeda-linked rebels exclusively in insurgent areas. Some of its members have participated in atrocities on video, another fact that's, surprise, surprise, almost entirely ignored by Western media. The other go-to source for Western media outlets is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a monitoring organization that's run by one guy working from his house in the UK, and he's openly biased towards the opposition. Meanwhile, the media totally ignores the victims in government areas. For years, insurgents in Eastern Ghouta have terrorized and killed thousands of civilians living in Damascus, which you almost never hear about in the Western press. And that brings us to one of the Western media's most pernicious lies, that Western inaction allowed the bloodshed in Syria to continue with impunity. The thing is, the West has been intervening in Syria since day one, and by doing so, it prolonged the bloodshed and empowered al-Qaeda. The Obama administration spent at least $1 billion a year training and funneling weapons to extremists they knew were linked to al-Qaeda in order to overthrow the Syrian government. In other words, the US government outsourced its war on Syria to al-Qaeda death squads. And Americans have no idea because Western media continues to promote lies about the West's so-called inaction. All in all, Syrians are pretty pissed off about the way the Western press has covered the conflict in their country. And who can blame them? To give you some perspective, it would be like America's adversaries funding and arming the KKK to invade and occupy cities in the US, and then calling them moderate rebels and freedom fighters as they kill minorities and shell civilians in Washington or New York. And then there's the massive double standard at play. After ISIS captured large cities in Iraq, the Iraqi government, with American air support, launched operations to retake cities like Mosul and Fallujah and Tikrit, which the Western press almost always celebrated and framed as liberation. Meanwhile, in Syria, the Syrian government, with Russian air support, has used the same exact military tactics to retake areas like Aleppo and Eastern Ghouta from groups really no different than ISIS, and it's been demonized for doing so. Look, I know the conflict in Syria can seem like a complicated mess, and in many ways it is. But as the howls from the media for the West to do something get louder, be mindful of the fact that there's an agenda behind their version of reality.